So we're not going to be talking about technology so much. We're going to take it for granted that there's important stuff happening behind the scenes in terms of how artificial intelligence is dramatically changing the way things can be done. We're going to be talking about almost the social impact of that technology. And in order to help me with that, I asked those of you who are coming tonight to fill in a little survey, and about 80 people did so. So interspersed through my presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the results of that survey. So, what is artificial intelligence? Here's a definition. It is the simulation of human intelligence processes by machines, especially computer systems. As Francois says, what are they doing? The people who are behind this stuff are trying to essentially figure out ways of taking our jobs away from us, trying to find ways of doing the stuff that we do and doing it for us using machines, for good reasons that I'll get into. What did you think, the 80 of you who responded to that survey, think about artificial intelligence as a threat versus an opportunity? Well, it turns out that you're an optimistic bunch, right? 11% of you said threat, 89% said opportunity. And it will not surprise you to note that tonight, for the next half an hour, I'm going to be talking about both sides of that challenge. There are threats, there are absolutely risks that the technology is going to take us to a place we don't particularly want to go, but there's a huge opportunity as well. And for those of us who follow what's happening and look a little bit further into the future, I would argue that actually we can kind of get ahead of the curve and we can use this technology to our advantage. A couple of slides just to orient you. Not everyone in the room really knows that much about artificial intelligence. I mean, you're reading about it, but you're probably still scratching your heads. This image from Hans Moravec is a beautiful way of capturing what is going on. He pictures a landscape which is gradually, where the water level is gradually rising. And the water level is the point at which essentially everything under the water is done better by computers, and everything above the water level is still but done better by humans. So you can see chess, Jeopardy, arithmetic, these games. These are all things which basically the computers are now ahead of humans. They will win every time. Driving is a great example. Driving's up there. As we know, autonomous vehicles are on the way. They're not quite there yet, but they are certainly going to happen within our lifetimes. But then you look at the high peaks. You look at science, designing of artificial intelligence, writing books. These are the areas which we humans still have an undeniable edge. Now, will we always have that edge? That is almost a philosophical question. It really it's not something we need to worry about tonight. We do know that the technology is increasing at exponential rates, and obviously that has scary consequences. But to be more prosaic, when you say what is actually happening in terms of the world of artificial intelligence and how it's affecting the world of business today, it turns out that actually there's not that much really cool stuff happening. This is an article in Harvard Business Review earlier this year by Tom Davenport. Process automation, just making existing processes work more efficiently. That is actually about half of what's happening in terms of AI applications. Cognitive insight, in other words, using clever technology to, for example, pick up on credit card fraud. And that's a big chunk. And the cognitive engagement, where we're actually engaging with computers to do almost predictive stuff, that is a small chunk. So if you follow the literature at all, you'll know that this is called artificial narrow intelligence. We figured out ways of making computers do certain narrow things really well. They can beat us at Go, they can do all sorts of clever things, but artificial general intelligence, which is computers which can replicate human activities in the breadth that we have, that is a long way off. Most people reckon it's a good 20-odd years away. Artificial superintelligence, well, that is absolutely the world of science fiction. Certainly not in my lifetime, probably not in the lifetime of anybody here. What did the survey results tell us about your views on how AI is affecting us today? Well, I don't know if you're deluded or whether you're just pragmatic, but the bottom line is that 49% of you said only between 0 and 25% of my job could be done by a computer. And another 44% of you said maybe 25 to 40%. And I think that's probably not untrue. I mean, that would be my kind of hunch. You know, even as a professor, we all like to think we're above the fray here. We all like to think that our jobs could not be robotized. But of course, there's little bits of everything that we do which absolutely could be and will be. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that later. So I then asked you, what about the future? How prepared is your organization? And the answer is, we're not prepared at all. So 37% of you said, are people prepared? Not at all. 41%, well, maybe we're somewhat prepared. We don't quite know where the world is going to go because we're a little bit scared about some of the prophecies we've heard. And I'll just give you this beautiful example of a prophecy by this chap, Ray Kurzweil. Some of you have heard of him. He's a celebrated sort of visionary. He wrote this book called The Singularity, and the singularity is essentially the point in time, 20 years from now, he reckons, where artificial intelligence will have caught up with human intelligence because it's growing at an exponential rate. He says that information-based technologies will encompass all human knowledge and proficiency, ultimately including pattern recognition, powers, problem-solving, and so on and so forth. You cannot prove that he's wrong, right? You absolutely cannot prove that that is an incorrect statement. And that is one of the reasons, I think, why we have to be sanguine about the opportunity here. We've got to see it both as threat as well as opportunity. So here are the two questions that we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about. How is AI changing the workplace today for us as individuals, and more importantly, for the practice of management? I want to make this about the world of management and leadership. And what, therefore, do we need to do to adapt to stay relevant? How do we become agile enough to succeed in this world? Again, I asked you a survey question, and this question was about you in terms of the things that you need to focus on as individuals, as your core strengths, which will enable you to do well in a world which is increasingly robotized and automated. And I wasn't in any way surprised by these results, but I was actually kind of assured in some ways, because what you're saying is that the things that the computers cannot do at the moment make difficult judgments and decisions. They can't be creative. They don't have empathy. They don't have the capacity to make intuitive judgments. Those four things together are the things that you said actually are the things that are most important for me as an individual. Now, whether you were consciously saying that's because the computers can't do them for us, I don't know. But I think that is exactly the right answer. That is the things that we need to do as individuals. And I've seen many, many people talking about those soft, more cognitive, more empathetic skills that we need to continue to accentuate in a world of artificial intelligence. But I want to answer a more difficult question than what should we do as individuals. The more difficult question is, what are the implications of all this for the practice of management, for the work that we do? What is management? Management is getting work done through others. That's what we all get involved in on a day-to-day basis. Here is a set of categories of what management is. What is management about? It's about coordinating things, making decisions. It's about motivating people. It's about setting objectives. And when I look at what is happening in the world of artificial intelligence, and I look at how it is affecting each of those four things, I come to a slightly scary conclusion. So let me just be clear about what I mean by that. I'll take you through each one of those in turn very briefly. Let's think about coordinating activities. It turns out that there are huge improvements in efficiency in terms of how coordination happens. This means both search costs as well as coordination costs and even kind of governance and contracting costs. You take a company like an Amazon, right? If I say to Alexa, sitting on my kitchen table, Alexa, order more dog food, I can be pretty confident that 24 hours later, dog food will arrive at my home exactly as planned, and I have no idea what steps went between my voice command and that arrival. I'm absolutely certain there were many, many steps involved, some of which were controlled directly by Amazon and Amazon's employees, some of them undoubtedly involving third-party suppliers. And if you think about the coordination intricacies of that, just that simple set of transactions, and how quick it is and how seamless it is, the productivity improvements are huge. And if you think about how that then plays out on the world, those of you who've ever studied transaction cost economics will know full well that as soon as transaction costs go down, that actually means that we can use market-based relationships much more than we used to in terms of what happens in a firm. So we can actually use subcontracting and third-party relationships in ways that were perhaps not as possible before. How do we make decisions in organizations? Well, this has been much talked about. I'm just going to give you one brief example. It turns out in field after field, experts, medical experts, experts in you name it, in the field of wine, experts believe that they are genuinely above the world of prediction and artificial intelligence. But time after time, it turns out that when you use the body of data amassed, for example, in detection of cancer, and you put all of this data into a system and you use clever pattern recognition software, it figures out ways of essentially codifying years, decades worth of expertise and actually coming up with better answers. There's a beautiful old example, the wine image here. This is almost isn't artificial intelligence, but it makes the point quite nicely. There was an economist called Orley Ashenfelter, and he upset the entire wine-growing region of Bordeaux by figuring out that he could use 3 variables, essentially to do with rainfall and sunlight, in a given year to predict the prices of Bordeaux wines going forward much better than the experts could. And of course, the experts poo-pooed his analysis, but unfortunately, the analysis was robust. The analysis was definitively true because he was then able to show that the algorithm he created did indeed predict future wine prices much better than most of the experts could. So algorithms will often beat heuristics. Heuristics are rules of thumb by experts. Not always, and obviously we need a combination, but in many cases, they are beating the experts. Motivation. You remember from your studies Frederick Winslow Taylor, the architect of scientific management, time and motion studies. This was from the 1920s. Well, I'm a little bit worried because artificial intelligence software is in fact enabling a sort of Neo-Taylorism to emerge in the workplace. There are many cases now where clever software is keeping track of every single movement and every single statement made by people working in a call center, people working in a factory. Factory and call center workers and Deliveroo drivers and Uber drivers can be controlled by the computer, by the machine, if you like, far better than before. And I do, of course, believe that a machine is a good servant but a lousy master. But it is absolutely possible in many areas for them to control the lives of workers in kind of scary ways. And then finally, what about setting objectives? Are computers going to help us in the process of setting objectives in factories? Well, I don't think they will, because in fact, when you start scratching under the surface of what these computers are doing, they're doing incredibly impressive things. But the algorithms and the deep learning and reinforcement learning methodologies they're using are all about delivering on a unitary objective, often in a very creative way. The famous case of Go, where the world champion was beaten by AlphaGo, which is a product of DeepMind, this London-based AI company. That case was celebrated because the machine came up with a move that no one had ever seen before. So you can argue that's a really creative solution. And it was creative, but it was very much creative within a very clear set of parameters about winning the game. So you give a computer a goal, it will find ways of getting there, but humans are more complicated than that in ways that I think will become clear in a second. So are we entering a brave new workplace? And I think you know what I'm getting at there. A brave new workplace meaning a kind of a scary one. If we allow the computer technologies of today to dominate the way that we think about work, we don't end up in a very happy place. Fortunately, my talk does not end there. My talk, I'm going to provide you some salvation, and I'm going to provide it through a famous departed professor called Sumantra Ghoshal. Some of you will remember Sumantra. So the question you've got to ask yourself is this: What is it that firms exist for? Why do we have companies in the first place? Why do we need management in the first place? You know, there's a classical way of thinking about it. I touched on it earlier. It's called transaction cost economic theory. Oliver Williamson, Ronald Coase. These guys said that a firm literally is a nexus of contracts. A firm exists to internalize and pull inside one place a whole set of complex transactions which would be too difficult to actually mediate on a market basis. The only reason we have firms, not markets, is because of high transaction costs. And of course, that's a very economic view of the world. It's not entirely wrong, but it is not a satisfactory view. And I think if we allow ourselves to be seduced by that view, we do indeed end up in that scary, brave new workplace that I just talked about. So Sumantra Ghoshal, he was on the faculty here. Many of you will know, have met him, 15, 20 years. He died, I think it was 13 years ago. He hired me. He was very much a mentor to me in terms of how I looked at the world. And he said this transaction cost view of the world is wrong. It's not wrong, it's just completely insufficient. Because he was coming up with what he called a managerial theory of the firm. He said a theory of the firm should actually be something that understands what value managers, individuals, humans, create in order to rise above the basic sort of transactions that go on in a firm. And so the line of thinking that he started us on actually leads to a very important and I think ultimately very helpful conclusion. We need the firm and the managers in the firm to do the things markets can't. That's what Sumantra said. And in this artificial intelligence world that we're moving into, what that means, logically, is that the firms that succeed will be the ones that really capitalize on those unique advantages, the things that we can do in firms through management, through good management, that the markets cannot. So let me just give you a few examples of what I mean by that. You know, firms, I'd said that computers are good at doing unitary goal-directed behavior. Do firms have unitary goals? No, I mean, they just don't. That's a chart that some of you will recognize, the triple bottom line. Firms have economic, social, and environmental goals. Now, they pursue them to different degrees, but all of those goals exist. You can't say the one single thing we're going to measure a company on, or indeed LBS for that matter, is the following. There was a famous London-based economist, John Kay. He had a relationship with London Business School 30-odd years ago. He wrote this beautiful book. It was called Obliquity. And he had this notion that goals are best pursued indirectly. He said that if you want to get to point A, you should actually shoot for point B. And the point he was trying to make was that actually the companies that deliberately give themselves a mission or a purpose or some sort of meaning in terms of what they're doing, trying to have an impact, a sustainable impact on the world, the way the business happens in the world, those companies would actually not just hit those missions, but also be financially profitable as an unintended consequence almost, or as a byproduct of their mission. So John Kay called this the oblique effect, and I think it's a really useful and mind-bending way of looking at the world. So what are the things that firms need to do in order to rise above the kind of the perils of artificial intelligence? One of the things that firms do is that they deliberately take this long-term perspective. Sumantra Ghoshal said it best. He said firms have to take resources out of their first best use and deliberately put them somewhere where, for a temporary period, they are not actually productive. You can call this research and development, you can call it leadership and development training. Less productive in the short term, but invested over time leads to better outcomes. One step backwards, two steps forward. Jeff Bezos said it quite nicely. Amazon is the biggest, value creator on the planet right now alongside Apple. Jeff Bezos says, you've got to be willing to be misunderstood. We've got to be able to do things which actually a lot of people don't understand because we have this long-term perspective and we know that if we invent new stuff, we will actually get to the future before others. Firms also create value, as I touched on, through purpose, which enables discretionary effort. Discretionary effort meaning getting more out of the people that work for us. And the LBS community is a great example of trying to create a purpose that creates discretionary effort. One example would be the Tata Group, which I think is famous for this, but putting, at the group level, Tata Sons are putting a big chunk of their profits into social goals within the various different communities that they serve. Another thing that firms do is they create value by allowing unreasonable behavior. Now, I'm a little bit cautious about showing a picture of Elon Musk. I realize that he's not the world's favorite guy right now. And yet, in some ways, the fact that he's not popular almost makes my point even stronger. Because, love him or hate him, and a lot of people right now hate him, I'll give you that. But he has created huge opportunities. He has changed 3 or 4 industries, despite the fact that he's a very difficult person. And the point I'm trying to make is that his unreasonableness, his desire to change the world according to his point of view, is actually one of those things that helps the world to move forward. Now, you've got to find a way of ultimately harnessing those people's energies for good. But ultimately, unreasonableness here is one of the decisive things that firms do. And of course, artificial intelligence software just can't somehow substitute for that. I'll give you a very specific example of what I mean by that. Those of you who work in the world of fund management, wealth management, will know that robo-advisors are coming along. Robo-advisors don't just advise you on what stocks to buy, they actually execute contracts nowadays. They literally take your risk preferences and your age and so forth, and they will manage your portfolio for you at a lower price, of course, than a human. Are these robo-advisors taking over the world of fund management? There's this battle between man and machine going on. My answer is, of course, there's a place for them, but we've also got to be careful, because if all those robo-advisors are actually working with the same algorithms, there is a real risk that they just copy each other and that they end up going to a place where, by definition, they're all making exactly the same return on investment. So I just love this article in the Financial Times. When it comes to investing, human stupidity beats artificial intelligence. And I think you know what he means. He's saying that actually, if you want to beat the market, by definition, you've got to be a contrarian. And a contrarian, of course, is somebody who deliberately, intentionally kind of goes in the opposite direction to that which the crowd have gone in. Now, can we imagine a world of contrarian robots? I mean, I guess we can. It's a long way off. But for me at the moment, that is the human touch, the thing that allows us to spot those opportunities and to grab them. So, to summarize this piece, and then I've just got a few final thoughts, my optimistic view of the workplace of the future, the work of management, is the following. What is it that we, as managers and leaders of the future and of today, need to become even better at? First of all, we've got to get better at managing the trade-offs in coordination. Computers are very good at helping us with pieces of the puzzle. Only we can make the trade-offs between the two in real time. In terms of making decisions, the old word judgment comes back. Judgment is, by definition, something which involves us making choices among a set of incommensurable things. We need to get the algorithmic support in terms of understanding what we might do, and then we need to be able to bring a little bit of emotional conviction and a bit of decisive action to the table to ensure that those decisions are the right ones for this particular moment in time. In terms of motivation, clearly inspiring and generating that extra discretionary effort is a big part of the story. And in terms of setting objectives, clearly purpose is a big part of it. So you've heard these terms before, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that there's some completely new thing that we should be doing that you hadn't heard before. But all I'm saying is that these aspects are the ones which are even more important given the changes that we're seeing in terms of computer-based technologies in the workplace. So, I have a couple of final thoughts just to turn this into something a little bit more practical for you as leaders. We need to play up our individual creativity, our empathy, our intuition, those human qualities, and we need to then use those to make the management work that we do more effective. What does that mean for our role as leaders of others? In other words, if our job is to lead teams of people who are taking this advice, how can we do that job a little bit better? So there was a study done, 15 years ago, by Lord Layard, of the London School of Economics. And he studies happiness. And he asked people, who are you happiest spending time with? It's your wife, your kids, family, your friends. Well, it turns out that we're happiest with our friends and our parents and our spouse. And we are the least happy with our boss. The person with whom we would like to spend our time least is the boss, and we prefer to spend our time alone than with our boss. So you draw your own conclusions from that survey. The point I want to make from this is the following. Look, it's hard to be a good boss. We all want to do a good job. But the truth is that it's actually really difficult. It's actually really difficult to meet the different demands of huge numbers of people who are relying on us on a day-to-day basis. I actually wrote a book on this a couple of years back called Becoming a Better Boss. And I said, look, management leadership, I'm going to bracket those two terms together today, is an unnatural act. It does not come naturally. It is something we have to consciously work on. And it's difficult because most of us, as we go up through our organizations, we are patted on the back for delivering good results. We like to be seen to be in control. We get promoted when we seem to be in control. And the higher we get, the more we've got to actually unlearn those old task control-based behaviors and actually move to a set of behaviors which are all about liberating the people around us. And all the points I made about creativity and empathy. As a leader today, our job is to liberate those attributes in our people. And so for me, there's this hugely difficult balancing act that we need to work on as leaders. On the one hand, a big chunk of our time has to be spent mentoring and role modeling the behaviors around creativity and empathy and intuition that I've been talking about. Spending time with the people in our team individually, in groups, making sure that they feel that they've got this atmosphere of psychological safety where they can try new things out, things which sometimes work, things which sometimes fail. Those difficult people that are easy to sort of get rid of, but actually are the unreasonable ones who shape things, those are the ones we have to work doubly hard with. And whilst doing that, we also have to remember that occasionally our job is externally facing. It's a little bit more decisive. It's about taking judgments about opportunities that we need to capitalize on now and actually championing those things in the external world. The reason I've got a picture of Amazon up here again is that I know Amazon reasonably well. There may even be some Amazon employees in the room. Remember, Amazon's at 500,000 people nowadays. And yet Amazon still is holding on to many of those values of entrepreneurship and simplicity and customer centricity that made it a success 10 years ago. And so they're doing quite a good job of balancing the nurturing on the one hand and the decisive new business opportunities on the other. So that is the challenge we face as leaders, is to get the right mix between internal and external and the right mix of skills to make sure we get the best out of our people. The final survey question that you filled in was a question about what are those leadership capabilities that you will need in the future? And I was, again, happily reassured here because it turns out that when you filled in these questions, I had some silly ones at the bottom, well, not silly, but sort of old-fashioned ones at the bottom about overseeing and monitoring and controlling. But you, of course, aimed for the ones which I saw as the intangible qualities of leadership, which have always been important, but are even more important now. So defining a sense of direction, acting decisively in periods of uncertainty, getting rid of obstacles, helping your subordinates to do their best work. And those are the top three by quite a long way. And so there is a point I just want to finish with, which is a link to a famous old statement from Warren Buffett. It's only when the tide goes out that you discover who's been swimming naked. What Warren Buffett meant was, in the world of fund management, right? Anybody can make money when the market's going up at 10 or 20% a year. It's only when the market goes down that you figure out which fund managers are actually worth their salt. There's something in what he says which has a parallel to the challenges of leadership. Because if you just go back to that previous slide, we used to be able to hide behind the old classical models of leadership, management. leaders would control things. They would monitor the behavior of their subordinates. They would be the conduits for the information flow. Those are the old skills of management that in an old world where information did not flow freely, we could use those as a way of justifying our existence. Nowadays, of course, that is not enough. We've actually got to be good at the tough stuff at the top. The stuff at the bottom occasionally is useful, but we earn our livings as leaders of the future by becoming good at the top stuff. And that's what Warren Buffett was talking about in the way I see it. So essentially, as the artificial intelligence revolution takes shape, as computer technology automates and simplifies a lot of the things that are happening, that's when we figure out which leaders are, as it were, swimming naked. In other words, which leaders are able to rise above that and do the really valuable stuff, and which leaders are somehow succumbing to the threat that I talked about earlier.
Recently, in the London Business School Review, there was a pretty good article, in my opinion, about how implementing technologies like AI, etc., in the workplace should be led from the top down, from the CEO level, and not necessarily just thrown to your analytics team.
That's right. Yeah.
However, in certain cases, I would argue that some leaders are a bit overeager to apply technology, no matter what the cost. Work in real estate, and what I see a lot is people throwing prop tech, et cetera, or we're going to apply AI to, outperform all our competitors. How do you, in your opinion, how does a company make sure that they're actually using this technology first in an appropriate way, and two in a way that actually meaningfully impacts results in the long term?
Terrific question. And you've probably heard this expression that we overestimate the short-term impact of technology, we underestimate the long-term impact. And there's this famous hype cycle, I think, that Gardner created, which basically says that these new technologies come along, everybody grabs hold of them, we get all excited about them, we go to conferences, we listen to academics, we listen to the consultants, and then at some point there's this inevitable kind of tailing off because it hasn't lived up to that short-term hype. So my advice is always, look, we have to have somebody who's keeping their eye on this stuff. But it is absolutely as risky to kind of overinvest in these things early as it is to underinvest in them. So blockchain is a great example, right? I mean, it's part of this same sphere of new technologies that we're not quite sure how to make sense of. I have not yet seen any really successful practical applications of blockchain. I know there are other prototypes out there. Now, it doesn't mean that someone shouldn't take a look at them, but it does mean that we should be cautious about throwing our entire weight behind them. I almost liken the blockchain revolution to the period in the 1990s when the internet had been invented, but the World Wide Web had not, if you see what I mean. Because there's all this talk about it. Suddenly, the World Wide Web enabled everyday people who had no concept of the technology to actually use this cool technology. And we don't understand how it works, and we don't need to. I'm actually thinking the same is true of many of these emerging technologies. We have to be conscious of what's happening. We have to have a few clever people monitoring it closely. But we shouldn't be all running in that direction, because we can absolutely get distracted from our day jobs.
So among the industries you had there on that graph, I didn't see business education anywhere, or the delivery of...
Good.
And so you talked about robo-advisors in fund management, and what's your view of where your industry might be going? It's about
Well, it's exactly. No, really.
Detecting patterns and coming up with theories, and that type of stuff.
We just got a call from the Financial Times yesterday saying they want to know what the really sexy stuff happening in business schools are, and they wanted examples of applications of AI and virtual reality, augmented reality in the classroom. And we were sorry to disappoint because, just as I said, I think that we've got to be on the case, but it is possible to jump too soon. Now, I happen to have as one of my jobs is heading up our digital learning activities. And so I've been leading a team over the last 9 months who have done huge numbers of experiments in bringing digital technology to our activities. You know, if there's a spectrum between, you know, we're all out of business here because you're going to be taught by computers in the future, through, you know, there's nothing about the technologies that's going to help us because, you know, the ancient Greeks had it right. The old Socratic method of teaching will last forever. You know, somewhere between those two extremes is a reality. We can call it blended learning if you like, where in fact the classroom of the future is actually going to be partly literally a classroom and partly an interactive virtual space. And so I actually just gave a little bit of encouragement to 10 of the faculty so that they could try themselves a bunch of experiments in blended learning to see what they came up with. And the other thing, I'm just going to make a little plug, a shameless plug. So I am actually, you know, one of the creators of a course, an online course, a so-called SPOC, a small private online course. We're calling it Innovating in the Digital World. It will launch for the first time in January. We've built this thing, and we're going to be running it mostly online, but with occasional workshops and sessions led by me and with some tutors. So we are doing stuff in this area, and it's exciting stuff. We are deliberately taking this really experimental approach to say, let us try a bunch of stuff. Let's make sure it's high quality. And then a year or two from now, we'll be in a position to say, this is the direction of travel we want to go in. And then we're going to put a lot more money behind it. So thank you for that. It wasn't a planted question, but it was a really useful one.
You're more on the threat end rather than the opportunity. You're more on the opportunity rather than the threat end of the spectrum in the survey, then I'm assuming.
Sorry, I missed that last question.
You're more on the opportunity end rather than the threat.
Right, exactly. Is the glass half full? Is the glass half empty? My colleague Kostas Markides says you have to treat it as both. You have to treat technology as both threat and opportunity to get the best value out of it.